It seems there are a couple of different camps in the atheist crowd. There's the woke camp, which is the new atheists, and then there's the old new atheists, just the new atheists. And the new atheists were started with Dan Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. They're called the Four Horsemen of Atheism, and that's a direct reference to the Book of Revelation. Now, I came across this particular video by Coleman, and Coleman asked a couple of big questions. He's wondering if wokeness is the new religion. Well, of course it is. Short answer of that is yes, it absolutely is a new religion. What I found in one of my studies that I just published in Ethics and Behavior is that the younger generations are significantly different from older generations, and the younger ones being people born after 1981. They're significantly different than people in older generations with respect to a number of things. One is with respect to their patriotism. They're less patriotic. Two, they're less likely to value the importance of God. Three, they're more likely to justify cheating, lying, and stealing. And they're more likely to justify things such as abortions, prostitution, suicide, euthanasia. Actually, no, euthanasia was not statistically significantly different, but they were more likely to justify all of those things. Why is that? Well, the younger generation doesn't have a particular affiliation with the idea of authority. A lot of them want to buck authority. And a lot of them have been raised in a society that has taught them that they should be scientific on one hand, and then on the other hand, they teach them very unscientific things about babies. For example, when life begins, human life, of course, begins at conception and fertilization, as people who are biologists have attested to. They also reject the idea of our cells, our chromosomes, our XX and XY chromosomes. They completely reject those, which is being anti-scientific. So the new social justice crowd is an anti-scientific bunch. And of course, to be anti-scientific is something that goes quite against what Richard Dawkins thinks. So let's listen in to Coleman as he asks Richard Dawkins a couple of questions here. And so it's nice to see you, Peter W. Yeah, 2 shows in one day. I was kind of bored and I decided I will go ahead and make another show because I watched this video and I thought this would be a really good video to respond to. He's making a bunch of good points, and the atheists are going to bend over backwards trying to figure out, for example, how we have this particular morality that tells us what's right and what's wrong. So here we go.
Which has seen the development of wokeness in the past 5 or 6 years as a consequence of the decline of Christianity and religion in the culture. And the argument basically says there's a religion-shaped hole in the human psyche. And as Christianity has declined in the West, something has now, there's been a vacuum that something now has to fill. And that's been filled with the belief that essentially the social justice catechism, that speech is harm and that only members of your race can truly understand your suffering, and that straight white men are evil and at the top of an oppressive hierarchy, and that group traits can be applied to individuals, and I can dismiss what you're saying because of your identity. And this whole thing has in some ways had a religious character to it. You've seen the development of things like white fragility and Robin DiAngelo, where her best-selling book is preaching this kind of masochism, on the part of white people to constantly apologize for the original sin of their racism.
Original sin is exactly right. I mean, it's spot.
Okay, so before we get to Richard Dawkins' comments here, and of course it's funny because I read a lot of the messages that were in reply to this video, and it was funny because a lot of people said, even before they watched the video, they were going to predict what Richard Dawkins is going to do. Of course he's going to disparage religion, of course he's going to disparage Christianity, and of course he's going to disparage other belief systems too. He's of course going to disparage God, and then again he's going to elevate science. Because I think that that's what bothers Richard Dawkins probably about this latest generation, is they're not revering science in quite the same way as he does. But before we do that, I want to say thank you so much to everybody in the chat. Doki Doki, thank you. Also on the last video, thank you so much for your super chat. That's very kind of you. Really appreciate it. Jamie Russell, Doki Doki, all great people in the chat. Peter W., good to see you. And so here we go.
That's what, yeah, quite right.
So all of this, part of this has been inflected with a critique of the quote new atheists of yourself and Bennett and Sam Harris and Hitchens, by saying, well, doesn't this prove that, you can't just get rid of religion because what might replace it could be worse? What do you make of that?
I think, by the way, I'll just comment, that is an excellent question, because it's one of those things that goes back to what a lot of philosophers have noted. Without God, who are we? It goes back to what Dostoevsky say. Everything's possible without God. You don't have a moral law. You don't have a divine moral lawgiver and someone who's going to hold people accountable. And so people do things that they think they're not being held accountable. They do sometimes really egregious things. If you look back at Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens, and you read his book called Rage Against God, Peter talks about how both of them left Christianity. They were raised as Christians, both left Christianity, and both began to rage against God. And Peter said he really could wish he could get some forgiveness for everybody from his family for all the awful things he did during that time. Now, I'm not disparaging atheists and saying all atheists do awful things. I'm saying Peter did awful things, apparently. And then Peter ended up becoming a Christian again, and he and his brother started sort of having it out before Christopher Hitchens' untimely passing. But before that, before we get to Peter Hitchens and that kind of thing, is again, without God, all things are possible. So take a guess here in the chat. What do you think Richard Dawkins is going to say? If you think that I'm going to be right about, he's probably going to go into disparaging religion and God.
It's the idea is that there's a religion-shaped hole which needs to be filled. I think that's condescending and unnecessarily contemptuous of humanity. It would be pathetic if humans had a need to have, if they've lost Christianity, say they have to have something else.
Let's comment on that too. Everybody has a God. Richard Dawkins has a God too. I have a God. You have a God. It depends on which God it is. Now, the God could be you. Some people believe themselves to be somewhat of a God, and some people believe in the divine God or different divine gods. So whichever faith you hold, you do believe in some sort of God. Now, it could be what you worship. And there are people today, I would say that some of the woke people certainly worship themselves. Their whole idea of bodily autonomy, they like to talk about that a lot. They like to talk about women's choices or their choices. And sometimes these are euphemisms for things that are rather morally atrocious. And so unfortunately, we see that kind of stuff. And that whole difference thing goes against the whole pro-fertility idea, where you say that it's a woman's duty, if you should become pregnant, to carry the baby to term. But I digress. Here we go.
They can't just take the world as it is, take reality as it is, take science as it is. They have to fill it with something equally silly, having given up Christianity. I think that's a condescending attitude to humanity, and I would very much hope it's not true. I would prefer that when people lose religion, when people lose supernatural religion, they do not fill it with some other notion of original sin, as you put it, quite correctly, but that they might fill it with a love of truth, a love of science, a love of the study of reality.
I guess a related question here is, well,
we do love the truth. We love the way, the truth, and the life. So I want to say thank you also to Nikki, who's also in the chat. She's joined us. So Nikki has a pretty good story. She was an atheistic Jew for many, many years. And not too long ago, I think it was not too long ago, she came to Christianity. And so that's absolutely wonderful. Always good to see a person come in the chat and share the good news. So feel free, any of you, if you've got a story you want to let other people know about, I'd love to have any of you come on the channel. It's always fun. Here we go.
Well, let me start by just saying this. I was raised with no religion at all, and I never missed it as a result. But I've talked to lots of people that were raised religious and then, later either became skeptical or something like that. And often I think they have the feeling of some sort of sacredness melting away. It's like, or at least when times get tough, they wish that they could turn to God or turn to religion for some kind of solace. And, again, that's something I've never felt, I think partly because I never had it to begin with. And life always seemed quite beautiful and sacred to me on its own. But to those people that do feel some sense of loss at the religious character of the world, What do you have to say to that feeling?
Well, like you, I empathize with the idea of a feeling of sacredness. But to me, I get that from science. I get that from contemplation of the
See, notice his thing again. His God is science.
Vastness of the universe and the vastness of life's complexity. I don't feel any need to replace one rather foolish kind of religion with another rather foolish kind of religion, which I think the sort of guilt trip, which is dinned into Christians. You're born in sin if you're a Christian, especially if you're a Catholic. Born in sin.
I don't think he understands Catholics very well. I was raised as a Catholic. The idea was you weren't necessarily you were born into a world of sin, absolutely. But you had a certain age of accountability at which they felt that God would hold you accountable for those sins. And that, of course, took place after you're just a little infant. Of course, as an infant, you can't commit any sort of sin. You're just an infant. You're just a tiny little being who can't communicate barely with the world in words or anything else. And so that's just that situation. But as far as this idea of sacredness, yeah, I think that's great that they both hold something sacred. We always ask, what do you hold sacred? Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor up at New York University Stern School of Business, he's done his moral foundations theory, and he talks a lot about what people hold sacred. What's interesting in moral foundations theory, just to kind of go off on a tangent really quickly, is it talks about the distinctions between liberals, conservatives, and even libertarians on what they hold sacred. Now, libertarians are very much focused on liberty, and the contrary on that is the idea of oppression. Very much focused on that. They like freedom. They don't want the government interfering. They want that kind of thing. Then you have people who I would say are liberals. And liberals tend to focus very much on fairness and care and harm. In fact, they focus on those really quite a bit, to the exclusion of other factors like purity or sanctity, which is, of course, related to the idea of the bodily, how important the body is, how important people are, how important each individual is. Each individual has a certain sacred value, going back to the idea that we're made in the image of God. Another thing that people who are conservatives tend to value more is also, conservatives value actually all of these values more equally, but they also value patriotism and loyalty, very important to them, and authority. So there's big differences between conservatives, liberals, and libertarians on exactly what they hold important, what they value. And it plays out in what you see when they're running political ads on either side, on these different sides for politics. A lot of the political ads for Joe Biden are going to talk about caring for the poor, because again, their big focus is care, harm, and equality and fairness, or equity. For them, it's, of course, equity of outcomes in many cases. For the people on the other side, on the conservative side, they're focusing more on equality of opportunities. That's something. Want to make sure that, not that we're leveling the playing field, but making sure that everyone has equal opportunities. That's very important. But also, again, going back to this idea of patriotism, you can see why Donald Trump was wildly popular among a bunch of people who were flying American flags. They're very patriotic, and they love the military. They love also the idea of authority. And so it's just something that's consistent and interesting. So here we go.
The very moment you're born, you have the sin of Adam inherited in you. Once you got rid of that, to replace it with a different kind of guilt trip, which is what the original sin of white guilt is about, then I don't have any respect for that at all. I think that people need to find a decent target for their reverence. And a decent target for reverence would be something like science, something like the wonders of science, and something like humanity as a whole, and a love.
So I guess we can add humanity to his targets. So we don't just have his God of science, he's also got the God of humanity. Again, little gods of humanity.
Of humanity as a whole.
So another related thing people worry about is that science only deals with what is, not with what ought to be. So that if we want...
Which is a really good point he's making right here. It's the idea that science is descriptive. Science is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. So the question is what we ought to do. Those are moral prescriptions. Science can't explain why we have this natural conscience inside of us that tells us when we're doing something right and when we're doing something wrong, really nags at us if we're doing something wrong. And so that's conscience. You ask yourself, where does that come from? We'll go back to Romans 2:15. God put a conscience into us because he wanted to make sure that we knew we had this code written within us that tells us what's right and what's wrong. Now, some people would say, oh, well, that's just natural. It's intuition. It's based on reasoning. Yeah, but where do you get to the point where there's a sacrifice? We're making a sacrifice for another human. Is that something you reason your way into, or you're intuiting it? It's not something that you might naturally be inclined to do. Like, for example, if I saw a child being chased by an alligator, I live here in Florida, my natural inclination is, of course, to run myself and get away from the alligator. But I'm told by my conscience, oh no, you go save that child. Risk your life and save that child. Jesus, look what he did for us, is he's going down there and he is being testified against by a bunch of people who made false accusations. His natural inclination, the thing that he wanted to do the night before, he was praying to God to take this cup and to free him from this requirement that God had for him. That's the natural thing. You want to save yourself. You don't want to go through a bunch of pain, a bunch of whippings, and eventual crucifixion. You don't want to do that. But through his immense love for us, he decided that he would go through that whole process of the crucifixion. And of course, then there was the resurrection. The beauty of that is in that moment on the top of Calvary, he did a few things. One was he reconciled God's perfect mercy, perfect justice, and perfect love. And that was just an absolutely beautiful thing. Here we go.
I want to make the world a better place. And I want to say people should act this way. People should act, good rather than like Ted Bundy. That science has nothing to say on that question and can't possibly. So how can we really ground our worldview in science if that leaves us in an amoral world?
I think academic moral philosophy, although not strictly science, is kind of like science. It's using the systems of logic, of reasoning. You cannot say absolutely what is right and wrong, but you can say, if you believe that so-and-so is wrong, then you're being inconsistent. If you believe that such and such is, or if you believe that so-and-so is right, then in order to be consistent, you ought to believe such and such. And one can apply logic to moral questions. It may be that there are fundamental premises that you can't actually deduce. You have to simply assume them. But once you have done, then much else follows. You can do that by a logical reasoning.
Yeah, I remain convinced by Sam Harris's argument on this point, which is, there's nothing cheap about getting an argument off the ground with a brute assumption. That's actually how all of our arguments work, even within science. It's like, at the end of the day, I'm not going to convince you that A equals A, like the law of identity. That's just something you feel in your gut, or you don't. And if you don't, I sort of don't believe you. And I'm not going to argue for it further because it actually can't be argued for further. And that doesn't make it any less of an invalid assumption. And if you allow those kinds of assumptions in the domain of morality, like Sam Harris's, assumption that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, right?
So Sam Harris has a book called The Moral Landscape. And the problem with Sam Harris is, actually the good thing about Sam Harris is he acknowledges we do have objective moral values and duties. He acknowledges them. But he does his acknowledgement by grounding it in this absolute goodness or badness, deciding that we all can agree on something. According to Sam Harris, we all can agree on something being absolutely bad. And because we can agree on that, we can build from that framework, from that premise. In the Christian faith, we don't have to go to what we all agree on. We just go with the truth. And so if we center our faith around what is the truth, and the truth is God, God is the source of our objective morality. And so everything's grounded in God, and it makes everything quite simple. So we want to know if we're doing the right thing. We just think to ourselves of whether or not we're doing what's consistent with what Jesus would do. That's why people say a lot of times, what would Jesus do? Because a lot of times if you want to know what the right or wrong action is, for the right action, you do what Jesus does. For the wrong action, you do what he would not do. And so it makes things pretty simple. And so we don't end up getting into this whole idea also that some other atheists, similar to Sam Harris, they look at this idea of the consequence and they say, okay, if the greatest consequence is this, then the source of our objective morality is also the consequence. So if we all decide that we want these good outcomes, then the source of our or framework or bottom end of our objective morality is also the consequence. It doesn't make any sense. It's circular reasoning. I've talked about it a lot before. A lot of atheists take the utilitarian framework of ethics, and they'll say, okay, I'm going for this particular positive outcome. The ends justifies the means. I want the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And they use that to make their judgments. However, the Christian will use the deontological framework that was also spoken of by Immanuel Kant. The deontological framework says we all have a moral duty to do what's right. And within that context, we can go back to the idea of the right to life. One thing we all know innately is human beings have a right to life. For people to get past that, and going back to the abortion debate, is they'll say that the baby inside of you is either not a baby. They'll say a fetus is not a baby. I just argued with some atheists yesterday on that. Fetus is not a baby. Well, yeah, a fetus is a baby. People just renamed the baby fetus because they wanted to get away from the guilt associated with killing their baby or their offspring or another human being, because we know innately within us that that's a wrong thing to do. They might say, well, the end justifies the means. I wanted to have a good life. I wasn't ready to have a child. I decided I wanted to pursue my career instead. That's no different than what the Canaanites did. The Canaanites sacrificed their babies too. They sacrificed them to the gods by burning them to death, thinking they'd get better crops. But I digress.
If you allow those kinds of bootstrapping assumptions, you can get a morality every bit as compelling and a morality with teeth every bit as much as you could from religion.
I want to thank everybody who's in the chat, by the way. Nikki, Doki Doki, Peter W, Xiami. Great to see all of you. I see a couple good points. Like Doki Doki says, all of Germany agreed on something 60 years ago. Yes, exactly. You can see where that goes wrong. It doesn't matter what all of society agrees on, because some societies have terrible things they agree on. If you go to the Pitcairn Islands, the fathers routinely break in their 10-year-old daughters, break them in by having sex with them at 10. And that's something that's acceptable in those societies. If you go down into the Amazon rainforest, guess what happens? Little babies who are born with certain deformities or anything like that, they may be not perfect, if you want to call it that, they'll kill them. They'll kill them because it for them, the ends justifies the means. It's easier for them not to have to raise a baby who has certain problems. And that's just a real terrible shame. Hi, thank you, Coffee Smug. So here we go. Yeah, and Coffee Smug, you're making a point. Kant grounded categorical imperative in pure reason. He also spoke, though, what I'm referencing Kant also for is the idea of deontological ethics, because he did speak a lot about our duties to do what's right. But you're reminding me of something. It's something that an atheist called Jonathan Haidt talks about a lot, is he focuses on this ideas of reason and intuitions. And as I tried to mention before, one reason that isn't completely 100% explaining everything in our experience is because we do also have these intuitions that guide us to do things that might actually hurt us sometimes to save others.
From science.
Well, yeah, far more than from religion, because you get it from religion, you get all sorts of horrible things. I mean, no moral person ought to base their morality on the Old Testament, for example, or on the Quran. But I
haven't read the Quran, I'll be honest, but I have read the Old Testament. And I think that if Richard Dawkins read the Old Testament, you'd be able to see it a lot better than you do. I don't think Richard Dawkins has ever, at least if he has, he's read it so many years ago, probably right before he wrote that terrible book, The God Delusion. It was a ridiculous book. I read the book. I critiqued the book in a blog. I've also read Sam Harris's book and critiqued that in a blog. These terribly not really well thought out things. In his book, he basically calls God a moral monster. And Paul Coppens has written a book that refutes what Richard Dawkins said in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? And one of the things in the Old Testament that we notice is the society, we're getting a description of what happened in an ancient culture. And in that ancient culture, it was very theistic. God was ruling over the Hebrew people. And God had certain rules for the Hebrew people, and he wanted them to obey the rules. And you can see the hammering process that C.S. Lewis called it, of the Jewish people going through these cycles of first obeying, then disobeying, then obeying, then disobeying. And if you go back to the Old Testament, you're going to see that in some of the books of Moses, they talked about the Jewish people going into exile. It was saying, if you don't obey, you will eventually be taken into exile. And of course they were. First, the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was taken into exile, and that was under the Assyrian kingdom in the 8th century BC and in the 7th century. And then later on, we had the southern kingdom of Judah being taken into exile under Babylon. And that was, of course, in the 6th century BC, the 7th and 6th century BC, because the Babylonians took over from the Assyrians. So again, those predictions were something that were in the Old Testament. And it was, again, because the Jewish people weren't obeying. In fact, if you haven't done this yet, and you want to see what Jewish people in ancient times were thinking about their Messiah, what you want to do is go to the Sanhedrin 98. You can just type that right into the computer, Sanhedrin 98. And you're going to see ancient people. Now, this, of course, is around the 5th century AD. But they realized that there are two types of Messiah in the Old Testament. They realized that there was the type of Messiah who was humble, riding on a donkey from Zechariah 9:9, and the type of Messiah who was going to be coming in the clouds of heaven, as in Daniel 7, and sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One in Psalm 110. And they said that if they weren't good, they didn't obey, they'd get the first one. And of course they did. Jesus, he came in on the donkey as he came into Jerusalem in the first day of the Passion Week. As he came in, he was declaring himself to be the Passover lamb. And he did that on the exact same day when the Jewish people would have been selecting their Passover lamb. Of course, he was crucified on the eve of the Passover. Passover occurred on Saturday. He was crucified the following Friday. And that would have been the time that the lamb would have been slaughtered. So you see how these parallels to the Paschal lamb, even from Jesus' story. It's very fascinating. So the whole book of the Old Testament, when taken together and considering the Exodus, Moses' story, and everything else, you can see how it was written to right all the way up to Jesus. Daniel even tells us exactly when Jesus was going to arrive in Daniel 9:9. And when he was going to be cut off. He said the anointed one would be cut off at 77 less 7. So here we go.
As you say, you can start with a brute assumption, as Sam Harris does. I mean, suffering is bad. And once you've got that assumption, once you've got that axiom, then there's a lot of logical work to be done.
See, the beautiful thing in our faith, God is the axiom. We don't have to all come up with an assumption and then hope everybody agrees with it. Not everybody thinks suffering is bad, Richard Dawkins. The Uvalde killer, did he think suffering is bad? No, he probably likes the idea of suffering. How about that guy up in Highland Park, Illinois? He certainly doesn't agree with you that suffering is bad. We've got people who are crazies all around the world doing horrific things to others because they enjoy watching other people suffer. So no, we don't have an axiom quite there, okay? Sorry.
Working out, therefore, what the moral thing to do is, given that you take that assumption.
So I've seen some data to suggest that while more secular societies are on average happier than religious societies, religious people within secular societies are actually the happiest and are happier than secular people in secular societies.
Did you catch that? Those of you who are in the chat who are religious in a secular society, you're really happy. And what they found for religion is they look at two different types of religion. They call it extrinsic religiosity or intrinsic religiosity. Now, extrinsic religiosity is the idea kind of going back to what President John F. Kennedy said. He said, it's not for you, do for your country. He said, how did he put it? Do for your country, if not for you. I can't remember. Well, extrinsic is basically, what is the church doing for me? Okay, I go to the church for the sense of community. I go to the church because the church provides me a sense of belonging, provides me that kind of thing. So that's what John F. Kennedy said. He said, it's not what your country will do for you. It's what you will do for your country. So the extrinsic idea is saying, what will the church do for me? And that tends to not lead to very pleasant outcomes. If you're just focused on extrinsic religiosity, that doesn't lead to terribly good focused outcomes. But if you're focused on intrinsic religiosity, and that's what you can do for God, and it's also focused on your relationship with God, very God-driven relationship, prayers, and pray, the acronym is the idea of praise, repent, ask, and yield. But if you focus on intrinsic religiosity, that has all kinds of beneficial health outcomes, very good beneficial health outcomes, a lot of positive health outcomes with respect to just a number of different things. One of them is positivity. It helps with depression. If you're feeling depressed, it actually helps that. So I think that's sort of what he's getting at here, talking about some of the reasons why people might be happy as the religious within countries. And I'm wondering about Coleman. I'd be interested to get him on my channel to interview him, because I'd like to hear more about what he's thinking. He seems like a pretty reasonable guy, and he's definitely well-spoken.
Curious if you have seen that or have any opinion in general on the relationship between religion, secular beliefs, and happiness.
The data, I suppose you're thinking of the data of Gregory Paul on or maybe other people like him, on different societies which are religious tend to be less happy.
This is so hilarious that he cited Gregory S. Paul. Gregory S. Paul is somebody who Matt Dillahunty was repeatedly citing in a lot of his debates. And it's very funny because he finally got up there with Glenn Scrivener. And Glenn Scrivener looked at the Gregory S. Paul study and realized it's a univariate study. In other words, it didn't control for anything. It's kind of like the gender pay gap. The OECD has collected data on gender, but what they do is they take all of the different data points, all of the females, all of their salaries, all of the males, all of their salaries, and they don't control for very important factors. Some of the important factors include things like the level of the job, the type of the job, years of education, whether or not the women leave the field, average hours worked. All of those factors are extremely important. And once you do control for those factors, which payscale.com has done, the gender pay gap is significantly reduced to practically nothing. It is a range between 97 cents and $1.03 to the male whites $1. Okay, what does that mean? At 97, 98, 99 cents, that's where we have people of color and white women. Okay, women of color and white women. And then you have over on the other end at the $1.03, Asian people, either male or female. So Asians tend to average more. And they also tend to be pretty heavily focused in the STEM fields. They go into the fields where people tend to make more money. But I'm digressing. Going back to the Gregory S. Paul study, all he did is he looked at levels of religion in countries, and then he looked at whether or not people were happy. This is a univariate two-factor study. It didn't control for all of these other factors. Now, Richard Dawkins realizes that the places where people tend to be pretty happy happen to have very heavy social safety nets. And actually, it might be that makes them so happy. Like in some of the Scandinavian countries, they pay extremely high taxes in the Scandinavian countries. Denmark pays extremely high taxes on automobiles, for example. You've got very, very high taxes, value-added taxes, about 25%, very high taxes on your income, 60% on $60,000, the equivalent of $60,000 in a place like Sweden. So the tax levels are super high, but they also take care of you from cradle to grave. Now, one of the things that's negative about that particular system is what they've really done is they've outsourced the help for the poor to the government. And why that's bad, outsourcing help for the poor to the government, is that it doesn't incite people to want to help their neighbors and to go in and help those little soup shelters and to do those different things so that you can also yourself care for the poor. And so one of the things that I've found as an outcome in those societies, in a lot of those societies, is what the Globe study found: very low levels of humane orientation. In other words, low levels of benevolence and universalism, which is basically kindness to outgroups. So you've got kindness to in-groups and kindness to outgroups have the lowest level. Germany has the lowest levels of all. Okay, here we go.
It seems to go with social welfare. Societies, countries, and states within the United States where there's a bedrock of social welfare, where people are less troubled by poverty, where they have more healthcare and things, are happier and are less likely to be religious.
And that's also because the churches have historically offered people help in society. So if you didn't have the government stepping in and doing all of these things, a lot of times people would have turned to the churches. Sometimes it could be extrinsic religiosity that guides them there. They think, what can the church do for me? But a lot of times the churches were providing those special needs for a lot of different people. So that's one of the reasons maybe some people have left the churches.
On the other hand, you just raised the point, which I was not aware of, that within happy societies, religious people are likely to be the most happy. I didn't know that. That may be related to the idea that religious people are less stressed because less fearful, perhaps, or perhaps they are less likely to get stress-related diseases, that kind of thing. I have heard that. I'm not very persuaded by it.
I think that one of the things that makes religious people happy, and just definitely makes me happy, is my life is fulfilled. I feel like it has meaning and it has purpose and it has value. And I have an extrinsic and intrinsic value. And there's an intrinsic value in every human. That's the beauty of Christianity, and what Christianity has really brought into the West is this idea of humans have value. We're all made in the image of God. Even if you don't believe in God, you're still made in God's image. You might not like that, but that's the truth. And no, I'm not here to promote any sort of a replacement theory, Blaster Master. So no, that's not what I'm doing this particular video about.
Is the evidence for that good?
It's been a long time since I've looked at it, so I can't say with any confidence. All I can remember is that it was provoking some interesting conversations at the time it came out.
Well, of course, it may be true. Even if it is true, it has no bearing on whether religious beliefs are true, of course. I mean, it could be a psychological fact that religious people are happier. I'd be surprised, but then who cares if I'm surprised? I mean, the data are what matter.
There could also be the conflating variable of belonging to a community.
All sorts of possible conflating variables. That's certainly a good one, yes.
Okay, so I wanted to show you also some of the comments on this particular video, because I think that those were what was really interesting. So hopefully you can see if you can see this. 613 comments. So he's had a lot of activity since he put this video out. It's got over 25,000 views. But some of the comments that were interesting. Now, this is funny, and this I, of course, disagree with. Believing in dogma saves you from having to think deeply, provides a sense of certainty, and bonds groups together who share the dogma. There's a person at my school who has a bumper sticker that says, "My karma ran over your dogma," which I think's amusing. But religion is persistent. So that's why religion is persistent, because it saves you from having to think deeply. No, it actually encourages you to think deeply. One of the things people don't realize in the Bible is it constantly calls on us to study the Bible. The Bible calls on us to educate ourselves, to be able to always give a reason for our beliefs. It's very important for us to understand our beliefs and why we believe what we do. You should never just believe something without looking into the evidence for it. I don't think that's a good practice at all. So he says, as a secular person, I think Dawkins' insistence of replacing Christianity with science rather than wokeness is way too simplistic. Science is a methodology, not a value system. Now I'm going to go ahead and give that one a like. That was a good comment there. So what is this next? I used to be interested in cults, extreme religions, and other powerful social persuasion that would lead people to do certain things. And then, of course, it happened to me as well. I identified as a trans for a few years, and now I realize it was a very similar phenomenon. It's not a cult, it's a culture. Same thing. That's interesting. Very interesting. This one says, Coleman, I have a gut feeling that the religion-shaped hole is actually a yearning for acceptance by society. And because religion typically for the longest time has been the measuring stick for that acceptance, we accepted people who adhere to the same code of conduct. Good comment. I think that's a good comment. So I think Wokism has become the new code of conduct. And I think you're right. I think that that's a really bad side effect of social media, unfortunately. Everyone's searching for the likes. You get that little dopamine hit when you get the likes. And the problem, the bad things that come out of that, is you can see these contagions just going through. And Twitter is a pretty bad place. I go there sometimes and it can get quite toxic. And people are constantly virtue signaling there. So they'll say something because they want to get patted on the back by a bunch of their friends, the woke mob, they call them. And that's pretty unfortunate. I have followed Dr. Dawkins all my life, and his book, The Selfish Gene, had more impact on my life than anything or anyone. Wow, he's got his gods. Richard Dawkins admits that people need a decent target for their reverence. Right here, he admits that humanity needs to have reverence for something, which is basically an admittance that we have religious instinct. In the same breath, Richard Dawkins, at the beginning of the video, made the claim that assuming that humanity needed to believe in something was condescending towards the human race. He is suffering from a massive case of cognitive dissonance and isn't being rationally consistent, since what he hopes to be true is taking him away from what he knows to be true. Richard Dawkins, in order to position himself on firmer intellectual grounds, should admit that humans are wired to believe in something. If he wanted to take this conversation one step further, he should flesh out what humans should believe in. Whatever he advocates for, it needs to be something that fills humanity with a sense of purpose. Telling people they should put their religious instincts into science is foolish, since science isn't as fulfilling to the soul as religion. This is a really good statement. So I will go ahead and give that one a like too. So, one of favorite people, science is science. It provides no code, no philosopher to live by. It's not something you can solely live by. Exactly. It's not prescriptive. That's the big conundrum that the atheist gets by. There's also atheists, they realize that conundrum. They realize that, wait a second, for example, do we have objective moral values and duties? And they'll realize that there must be an objective, transcendent moral lawgiver if we all have transcendent moral values that transcend generations and transcend people. They realize that. So they become what they call moral relativists. And they say that it just depends on what the relative views are in various societies. That's what morality hinges on. But the unfortunate thing for the moral relativist is I could go steal their purse or steal something from the relativist and say that's perfectly acceptable in my society. Sorry. So, oh, here's something. I greatly admire Dawkins, but he's missing the point here and failing to make the is-ought distinction. Like it or not, reason is the slave of the passions, as Hume observed. We have not yet evolved beyond the limbic system, and until we do, the elephant is still in motion. Of course, reason must shape our epistemologies and direct our actions, but we ignore our emotions and their concomitant biases at our peril. And there will always be a pre-rational yearning and response towards reality that opens and fills the gaps in our understanding of the world. Okay, I agree with that part too. So in the chat, what did you think of this video? What do you think about what we watched, the video we watched today? What are your thoughts on that? Just curious to know. I wasn't planning on making this video until I saw the Dawkins video and I decided that would be a good deal. Let me just find the one comment that I really appreciated. There was another one down here somewhere. So let us go. And we have, I might not be able to find it because he's got a sea of comments in here. So this person, Marina, says, I think that people, I think this is the comment I liked. I think that people are looking for meaning in their existence, a purpose that is greater in the world in which they are so small. It is easy to build an idea that you are immensely significant in the plan of the universe. That is why some do, to cause and effect, imagine that there must be a supreme being pulling the strings and caring about everyone's life. And religion is something that is practices in collectives. Wokeness fills the same idea. They find a cause, make moral judgments, justify it with bad science run by activists. Completely rejecting that science should be value-free, i.e. should not make moral judgments. Science should just find out and explain how the world works, theories based on proven objective facts, the idea of which woke activists reject altogether. Wokeness builds communities in which there are strict rules on what to believe or say. If you question those beliefs, you get ostracized from the community. She is very right. So that is a thing. And you can see that. We've seen it a little bit on Twitter when somebody makes a statement and it goes against what the general narrative is. People are following the narratives and you just keep seeing it. And so that's very unfortunate. And I think that actually wasn't the one comment that I had seen earlier. The comment was by a female who had blonde hair. So I will try to find, must be a pretty sharp female if the female's got blonde hair. Just kidding. just kidding. So anyway, so what do we see here? Did you know that wokeness is a word that people who promote replacement theory are using? This really feels like a soft dog whistle with the wording of the title here. Well, I didn't pick the title wording. Is wokeness replacing religion? Actually came from the video we just watched. That was his title. That's Coleman's title. And I thought the title, I will use that same title because then Coleman will be able to easily find my video if he searches for his video. And so that would be something that I think would be a good deal because I would like Coleman to come on my channel. If anyone knows Coleman or has interactions with Coleman, I think, oh, here's the comment. I think it'd be great if you could let him know I'd like to have him on my channel. So, because someone just asked me yesterday on Twitter, actually, this person's called Professor Flynn. He said that he's noticed that I haven't had as many atheist conversations. I used to have many more atheist debates and conversations. And one of the reasons I don't really do as many debates anymore is because I find that I take a lot of preparation, and a lot of people are pretty much set in their opinions, and you're not really changing minds in debates. I think it's a better approach just to have kind conversations with people where you try to extend the olive branch to the other side. And so I've had some pretty good conversations with atheists and agnostics over the years, and even including a family member, my brother, he's an agnostic. And so we've certainly had pretty good conversations. But here's what Robin says. You see that blonde hair on Robin there? That's how I remember her. I think both men need to think long and hard about the word sacred. I've met few atheists who had hope of any kind. Most have been nihilists. Morality only comes from truth, and we live in a post-truth world. Dawkins ought to actually read the Old Testament for its content rather than as mere literature. Religious people are happier because they have hope. That is so true. Even in secular countries in Europe, they haven't abandoned the church altogether. They still go there for Christmas, Easter, weddings, baptisms, funerals, which is odd because there is no reason for truly secular people to observe any of those things. I will give that one a like. Forgot to like that earlier. And let's see what the reply. Here's somebody reply. I'm glad you specified your experience. I think you'll find there is less nihilism now in these circles. To continue to label atheism as nihilistic is to do it a grave injustice, which only serves to strawman it in a Christian apologetics paradigm. More and more folk are beginning to see sacred as not just a domain of religion and Christendom, etc. Defining it properly would go a long way to reconciling matters, to be honest. Okay, well, those are some pretty interesting comments. So the next thing, one thing I'm going to be doing a video on soon is I'm going to do another video on pregnancy resource centers, also called crisis planning centers. Crisis pregnancy centers. In that video, I'm going to talk about some specific relationships that I've found between abortions, induced abortions, whether they're surgical or medical, surgical being the ones that are performed in the hospital or in the Planned Parenthood facility or a place like that, or the medical ones, which is the pill, and the connections between those and preterm births, which there are connections. Meta-analytic studies provide support for that. And the preterm birth means the birth before 37 weeks. So there are connections between that, especially and really only from the surgical types of abortions. And of course, it depends on when the abortions occur in the gestation period. Also, it looked at connections that some studies coming out of the Eastern countries, places such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and China. A lot of studies, meta-analytic studies, have found a link between breast cancer and surgical and medical abortions. And one of the reasons why those societies are a little more ideal than Western societies is because Western societies, in the studies that I found, unfortunately, don't control for the many, many factors, all of the factors that sometimes they'll control for one or two, or they'll control even for 5 or 6. But there's so many factors that impact breast cancer in the West that are much more prevalent in the West than you find in the East. So some of those studies have been conflicting, especially been pulled with data from the West, where levels of obesity are at sky-high levels, which is, of course, correlated to breast cancer, where drinking, smoking, all of those different habits are also much higher than the East, where people's heights are taller. Height is apparently also correlated to breast cancer. And so we've got some interesting things going on right there. But the third thing I also looked at was infertility. And I found that it depends on whether it's surgical or medical, but there is a kind of a significantly higher risk of pelvic inflammatory disease that does have links to infertility. And those links occur for both surgical and medical abortions. You have between a 2 and a 4.9% chance of having pelvic inflammatory disease from an induced abortion. So just pointing a few things out. I'm not trying to shame anybody if you've had an abortion. That's definitely not what I want to do. I drove someone to an abortion clinic many years ago because I also thought that the baby was a clump of cells. And so that is not my plan. So anyway, Thank you so much. So Nikki says God allowed slavery but never condoned it. I so agree with you, Nikki. As a Jewish believer in Yeshua, God's story in Exodus is to free us from slavery, Josh. That's the entire arc of Exodus. Absolutely. Free us from the slavery. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see how we got into Egypt in the first place. And so you have these brothers selling their brother as a slave to the Egyptians, and he ends up making his way up to the top of the food chain with the Pharaoh, and he's able to foretell the Pharaoh's dream and to tell him, hey, you better store up grain, and because we're going to have famine in a few years, so store up grain now. And of course, then his brothers came back, and it's such a fascinating story. So that's how they all ended up over there in the first place. So it's kind of interesting. So I want to say thank you guys for coming in the chat. Please like, subscribe, do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for God's glory. Thank you so much. Have a great night or day.